there's two ways that a medical device can get on the market. We're talking medical devices now. Drugs are similar, but there's a little bit of a different process. But medical devices can either get on through what's called pre-market approval, where they run through rigorous clinical studies. I think that's about 1% of the medical devices. The rest get through what's called 510K clearance. It's a regulation that says if this medical device is substantially equivalent to another one that's already on the market, and you can show that, and it's basically a checklist and some paperwork you file, it can be cleared to be sold. And that's how all these products got on the market. None of them had pre-market approval. And they were all piggybacking on prior products. And if you followed the chain all the way back to the beginning, the start of the chain was some products that were actually recalled and products that were failed products, but nobody goes back to the roots. It's as long as you're somewhere on the tree, you're okay, even if the bottom of the tree gets cut out. So that's how a lot of these get on the market.
In this episode of the Holistic OBGYN podcast, I brought on an attorney. His name's Adam Slater. He's litigated in innumerable trials on behalf of women who have been damaged, often irreparably, from mesh that has been placed vaginally for prolapse symptoms. Now, before you get all in a tizzy, especially if you're an OBGYN listening, bear in mind that when women have bad things happen to them in our care, they're not going to go back to you necessarily to describe how horrible their pain is or how bad their symptoms are. They may just go to another surgeon altogether and say, that surgeon messed up, even if you didn't mess up, and I want you to help me, right? So there are some of us who, even see women who give birth in the hospital, and while you were their attending doctor, they're attending OBGYN or their midwife, they may come to me and tell me the terrific story that you've never even heard, and you don't know what you don't know. So I want to have a little bit of compassion for you out there. If you're a urogyn or an OBGYN and you've done some of these surgeries, or you're a woman who's experienced a complication or not, maybe you benefited greatly from this, just listen to this with an open mind, because Adam goes into not just his litigation around transvaginal mesh for prolapse symptoms. He also gets into the inner workings of the FDA and conflicts of interest and payouts to doctors to talk about various things in the media, so that we as consumers can become very, very confused. So one of the takeaways from this is that if you are a birth worker or a medical professional of any kind, it is actually incumbent on you to do your own research and then read the studies that are provided by the, let's say, sales reps for some pharma company or device manufacturer. Read the papers they give you, and then look at the references that are cited in those papers. This is what our job is. It's not just to prescribe the pills. It's not just to know how to do a physical exam or how to do a surgery. You have to make this your life. And Adam was gracious and generous with his time here to talk about what he uncovered in this process. And he's a really, really good guy. He's not somebody out there with a billboard on 64 with were you injured in a whatever, come and find me. He's not that guy. He's a guy who plays baseball, as an adult in like a very, very acclaimed adult travel league around the nation. And he's got kids, he's got a family. Like he's a guy who never even would have found himself in this place had he not just started seeing these cases emerge. So I think you're going to get a lot from this episode. Before we get into it, I also want to say there are a lot of podcasts that require you to pay for the extended version and whatnot. I try to keep my conversations pithy and authentic and kind of straight to the point. Ayla Cuenca was a previous guest, and she had described me as a hard hitter, but she meant it in the most loving way. Thank you for going straight to the point and asking the hard questions. This is one of those conversations that is that. There's a lot of confronting stuff here. So try to come in with an open mind, open heart. And I think that this information is valuable to anybody who's had kids, who attends to people having kids, anybody with a woman in their life. There's something in this for you, especially because we just came out of the years of COVID where we felt like the 3 and 4 letter organizations aren't doing the best job of they're not doing their job, period. And at times it seems like the odds are stacked against us as consumers. And so I feel you there as a consumer as well, as a human being who's a father, who's a husband, and one day will be a grandfather, and who's really compassionately and in a very freedom focused, patient centered, heart centered way, trying to improve the odds that women can get through the medical system without being harmed. And so, with that, I'll say that I don't charge for the podcast. I don't expect anybody to pay me to do this. I'm paying for all of this out of my own pocket. And I do have a couple really, really good companies who have aligned themselves with my mission. And they generously give a little bit of money for each episode. It doesn't offset the entire production cost, but it is really, really helpful to have them. And I want to highlight two of those companies right now. The first is WeNatal. WeNatal is one of uh, the more contemporary prenatal vitamin companies that does this not for the purpose of making a huge profit, but it was created. Their formulations were created in part and driven. Let's say the process was driven by women who had experienced miscarriage and loss, and they wanted a better option out there. They wanted a prenatal vitamin that was going to give them adequate nourishment on top of an already healthy lifestyle. I've interviewed Ronit and Vita, two of the founders of WeNatal. They've been on the podcast. Go and check that out. But these are women who are doing work for the same reasons that I am. They really, really want to see an improvement in maternity care. And what I love about WeNatal is not only are you getting adequate amounts of things like choline and vitamin D and methylfolate. They're not using folic acid, which 40 to 60% of women are not going to be able to metabolize and utilize for some really important enzymatic processes and protein building and nucleotide synthesizing and DNA building processes that are required to grow a healthy baby. They're not using that. They're not using folic acid because they know that methylfolate is what's found in beef liver. Folate in a variety of forms is found in nature, and your body's better able to utilize that. That's like one of the big things. And there are a variety of companies out there that do that. They've been sponsors of the show. I've had them on the podcast, but WeNatal is my favorite because they don't do a whole bunch of other products. They do his and her prenatal vitamins with a focus on getting yourself in to getting your health in order long before you even get pregnant. That's so critical. You want healthy sperm to meet healthy eggs to grow healthy babies. And you, as the mother who's growing this baby, you need to be as nourished as possible going into it. It's almost as if once you're pregnant, you really can't do a lot more. Like you're left with what you've got, and you got to get those reserves up as much as you can. So WeNatal is my preferred prenatal vitamin company. They send you, when you go to wenatal.com/beloved, you can subscribe and get a monthly sleeve of capsules to refill these beautiful glass jars. I've been using WeNatal for a while, but I save the glass jars. And even when I'm out of vitamins, I'll load up my organ meat capsules and all of that, my Immune Intel AHCC, which I'll tell you about in a second. And I travel with it. They're these beautiful little jars. So you're not getting the abundance of waste through packaging that you get with a lot of other companies. They also appreciate that there's a mind-body connection here in this preconception all the way through postpartum, these phases of our life. And for both men and women, dialing in some of the more spiritual, the mental, the emotional aspects through journaling and other exercises is equally as important as your physical nourishment. So they include a journal for you guys to utilize. I utilize this in my Born Free community. It's just a really, really great product. And I love meeting good people doing good work. And that's why I was happy to have them come on as podcast sponsors. And I've had to say no to a lot of other companies. So the one other product that they make is a fish oil. It's their Omega DHA Plus. And if you go to wenatal.com/beloved and purchase any of their prenatal products, I recommend doing his and hers, but to each their own. They're gonna if you add a bottle of their Omega DHA Plus to your cart, it's gonna be completely free to you as a first-time purchaser. So wenatal.com/beloved, support them. I love these guys, and I think you're gonna love them too. The other sponsor is Immune Intel AHCC, which is made by my friends at The Medicine. They have a great podcast, Mimi and Chase. It's called The Medicine Podcast. That's medicine without the E. And if you go to themedicine.com, again, it's medicine without the E at the end, you're going to see that they have a couple different products there. One is Mushy Love, and the other is Immune Intel AHCC. These are both functional mushroom products. And if you use code Beloved10, you'll save 10% on either of them. But I want to talk a little bit about Immune Intel AHCC. This has become a hallmark of my therapy for women who are struggling with persistent HPV. They're facing a leap in the procedure in the future, a cold knife cone in the future. They don't want to lose a chunk of their cervix, but their paps keep coming back abnormal. They don't know what to do. In that acute phase of worry and fear and all of that, I get them dialed in from a lifestyle standpoint, but we add in Immune Intel AHCC because this product made from the mycelia of shiitake mushrooms has been clinically demonstrated in vivo in human trials to help clear or reverse this positive signal for HPV. And that is really, really important because most OBGYNs are going to say, oh, it's positive, or your PAP's abnormal, or whatever. Come back in 6 months and we'll see if it's still abnormal. And then we'll talk about painful biopsies and then maybe later LEEP procedures. Well, you don't want to take a chunk of your cervix off if you don't have to, because that's a sexual organ. There's all these nerve endings there. So fortunately, we do have this acute functional whole food blend in Immune Intel AHCC. And AHCC stands for active hexose correlated compound. It works by boosting your NK cells, your T cells, which are important for immune regulation, but also important for scavenging precancerous cells, which is why I think it's so effective for this. It's used for a variety of other things, but this is one that is really, really near and dear to me, especially because Mimi, one of the founders of this supplement, she and I created the Clear and Free program where we go through all the lifestyle modification, we demystify the screening process, and we include a bottle of Immune Intel AHCC when you enroll at clearhpv.com. But for podcast listeners, if that program is not for you, you can still score some Immune Intel AHCC with code Beloved10 at themedicine.com. You'll get 10% off. I adore these guys. I adore this product. I'm very, very selective with the brands that I bring on here because I want to make sure they're doing it for the right reason. And there is very, very little profit margin on Immune Intel HCC. I promise you that. So 10% is a very, very generous offering. That's that. I take Immune Intel on a quarterly basis, just a whole bottle, just until it's gone, because I know I feel better. I perform better. My health is better. My wife and I have not gotten sick this entire winter. And I think it's in big part because of Immune Intel HCC. So, and trying to sleep as much and eat healthy food and all that. But anyways, thank you for supporting the sponsors. They keep the lights on here. Let's get into my conversation with Adam Slater. If you have any questions at all, you can find me at belovedholistics.com. You can find me on Instagram at Nathan Riley OBGYN. You can find our Born Free community with me and Sarah Rosser, our co-creation at bornfreemethod.com. But really everything's centralized at Beloved Holistics if you have any questions about anything. And if anything in this conversation touches you, share it with your friends. Leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this episode. I love you so dearly. Thank you so much for giving me an hour of your time here with Adam Slater. I couldn't do it with you guys without you guys, and I wouldn't do it without you guys. I'm doing this really from the heart, and I think you're going to love Adam. So let's get into that. All right, Adam, it's taken a little while for us to get into this interview setting, and but I thought it was very important that we do. I want to just gloss over a couple little things that I think are important to people right now, which is this topic of pelvic organ prolapse, which can happen in a variety of different ways. People that are overweight, they're smokers, they're diabetic, they're postmenopausal, they may develop a prolapse or bulge-like symptoms or urinary symptoms, and they go to their doctor. And then their doctor is going to maybe, toss around some topical estrogen and pessaries.
We're just talking right now, background, right?
No. We're going in. We're going in now.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize.
No. We're going into background. But you're a litigator against pharmaceutical companies and device manufacturers who are selling these products in a very compelling way. I've sat with these guys. They've been in the surgeries with us. They just want you to know how great these devices are. But to fast forward through that, we've got these products that while I was in residency, we were placing vaginally, we were placing mesh for a variety of different prolapse issues. And the topic of mesh had come up while I was in residency. And, a lot of women were having mesh eroding through the wall of the vagina. There was all sorts of things happening. So as a quick little history lesson from what I'm able to appreciate, and this is also through ACOG's practice bulletin, 2011, the FDA removed many transvaginal mesh products from the market. In 2016, the mesh devices were labeled as high risk. And then by 2019, which was after I was just finishing residency, the FDA ordered manufacturers of all remaining surgical mesh products indicated for transvaginal repair of prolapse symptoms to stop selling and distributing their products in the US. However, there's a lot of doctors that are still using it. And now that's where you come in, Adam Slater, a litigator against some of these companies who make a very compelling case in the hospital system as to why their products are uniquely beneficial over native tissue repairs and whatnot. So I'm going to stop talking there. And I want you to tell me a little bit about this problem of these big corporations, first off, without getting into the urogyne stuff. What is the big issue? Why are we having this ongoing issue with the FDA? Look there, because the FDA does not seem to have really fixed this issue.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. So I'll try to take it one step at a time. So pelvic organ prolapse, you described it. The vagina or the rectum can basically drop down into the vagina based on weakening of the pelvic floor. It could be for a variety of reasons. What happened was, for many years, doctors, for all years basically, were just treating it surgically. They would use, if they were treating it surgically, they would use stitches. They called it native tissue repair. They would sew you up, they would tighten you up, and you'd go along, and it would last for a long time, and sometimes it'd have to be repaired again. What happened was some doctors got the idea, let's take some hernia mesh and let's cut little pieces of flat hernia mesh and start sewing it into the repairs when a woman has a larger prolapse. So the companies are always in touch with the doctors because they have sales representatives crawling over their offices.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the word
so the
got
hernia mesh guys over there, like, oh, the gynecologists are having an issue with something that might require mesh. Let's get started on that. Kind of something as simple as that.
As simple as that. So the companies found out about this and said, well, let's start to promote this. Let's start to have doctors who we pay speak about it at conferences. And let's sell our hernia meshes and promote them, even though it's an off-label use, let's promote it. But then what they did was they said, wait a second, let's take the hernia mesh, do absolutely nothing to it other than put a name on it that makes it now a pelvic product. And let's sell it to the OBGYNs and the urologists who are doing these surgeries. So for example, Johnson & Johnson took Proline hernia mesh and renamed it Gynemesh. Now it's for a GYN indication, and they started to then promote it, and they started to have people speak on it. So they basically said, okay, we see something that a few doctors are doing in some unique cases, and we're going to now push it to become a standard procedure. And that's really where the problem started, was the companies realized that we can now get the key opinion leaders, is what they refer to these doctors who speak at these national conferences, to start saying, I'm doing this and it works great. And by the way, they have a great department that will teach you how to put in the right diagnosis codes so you can get paid sometimes for 2 or 3 surgeries in one operation, because you could do rectal prolapse, you can do vaginal prolapse, you can do vault prolapse, you can do another procedure for stitching in this part. You could do 6 or 7 procedures and get paid for all of them. I mean, these companies know exactly how to talk to the doctors and how to get them interested. And basically what they did is, as we now talk about what the real big problem was, they said, okay, well, this isn't enough money and this isn't enough. So what they then did is they developed kits, self-executing kits, where you'd get the mesh, you'd get all the instruments, and you'd get a booklet with the procedure to do actual procedures. And they started to sell procedures, and they put out a story and said, these native tissue repairs, these standard operations with the sutures, they don't last. And they started this story, and they started to alarm all the doctors. They told the doctors, you're doing these things, but it's not working for your patients. They're having failures within a year or two. They're having all sorts of problems. We can give you permanent fixes and we can sell it to you in a kit, and you can make a lot more money and you can do really well. And so they essentially created the market for an operation, which I hope we'll get to talk through in more detail, which was
Yes.
never needed. And
Yeah.
I went deep into the literature on this for years with some really top experts in the field. And they taught me this, and then they taught juries, and they talked about the fact that the literature actually didn't support the need for this. And actually it was the opposite. And then of course, the backside of it is it was put into many, many women. And unfortunately, it catastrophically harmed many of those women because the risks were never actually focused on, because there was such a focus on marketing and money, which is
Right.
unfortunately the story with all these types of cases. Profits
Yeah.
over safety. So
Yeah.
I hope I got into it a little bit, but there's a lot.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that was a big opener. But I want people to appreciate that, we have these 3 and 4 letter organizations, the FDA being one of them. In other cases, the CDC, we have NIH funded studies that support pharmaceuticals over other types of remedies or nothing at all, right? We are seeing this evolve. And I think over the past couple of years, we've seen these oversight, these regulatory agencies starting to slip a little bit. And it's so obvious when you start to look at the literature. In fact, since we're talking about native tissue repair, a lot of people are thinking, but the mesh must be better than the native tissue. However, when Cochrane Review, which is a group of collaborating MDs, PhDs, epidemiologists, they get together and they will ask specific clinical questions, and then they'll try to do a meta-analysis of all of the data available. There was a systematic review done by Cochrane of 7 RCTs, randomized controlled trials, that looked at synthetic mesh, or quote biological grafts, in POP surgery. And they found that they were associated, this is within GYN surgery, associated with unique complications not seen in POP repair, that's pelvic organ prolapse repair with native tissues. So what they have found is that when we're using this mesh to get into the next step of this conversation, we're seeing higher rates of recurrence, meaning needing repeat surgeries for many women. And that also implies that there's a recurrence of those prolapse symptoms that were presumably going to be fixed by this otherwise pretty challenging surgery. Recurrence or even de novo development of stress incontinence or mesh exposure, which leads to degradation of the vaginal tissue and may even require you to stop having sex altogether. So this is a big thing. And so what I would like to get into next is, okay, so we've determined we've created a solution. We've created a problem for a de novo solution that is going to make a bunch of people a lot of money. Now, the person who suffers the most from this are the women who are undergoing these procedures at the hands of their trusted surgeon. Can you maybe share an example of what one of these cases may have looked like, where a woman actually said, I feel like I was kind of robbed of my sort of health as a consequence of one of these procedures being done that perhaps would have been avoided had we used native tissue?
Yeah, I definitely can do that. And I want to make sure that I make one thing very clear, because I was talking about the surgical options.
Yeah.
Surgery is not always needed. And that's one
right.
of the other things. The medical device companies only make money if you're operating as a doctor on a patient. They're not getting money if you tell a woman to work on her pelvic floor strength with Kegel exercises. And I've had many clients who had surgery for what you described, stress incontinence or prolapse, then had issues. They had mesh removed, didn't want to get more mesh, and then started to use the exercises and actually got improvement. And they said, my gosh, I wish I had been told to try that for a longer period of time before the surgery. I could have avoided it. So I want to make clear, this is not a surgical problem for all women, although the literature paid for by the companies would suggest that, and the doctors paid for by the companies would suggest that. So I could give you many examples. I've represented, unfortunately, several hundred women that went through this and had in most cases, very bad outcomes. The storyline is very common. Most of the women that got these mesh products didn't have a life-changing problem. They had discomfort, they had some inconvenience. They then got the mesh put in based on the promise of a permanent fix. You're going to be able to have better sex. It's going to last longer. It's going to be more resilient. You can be more active. For example, women who worked as forklift operators or worked on the floor at Home Depot and were active physical women. Oh, well, this is what you want because the native tissue sutures, they won't last with the heavy work you do, etc. And then it goes wrong. And when it goes wrong, one of a doctor who I became very friendly with over the years because he worked on a lot of these cases, and I got to know him because he was one of the people in the country that was really empathetic to this and developed an expertise at removing the mesh. He once said to me, there was no exit strategy for these products. They were great at telling people how easy it'd be to put in, how fast they could do it, so they'd know how many hours of operating room time they could take and how many procedures they could do. But they never actually trained anybody how to get it out because there was no study in terms of how to get it out. So now it happens. Easiest one is probably when the mesh just erodes up through the vaginal tissue and the doctor has to now go in and cut away the mesh, cut away the tissue, clean it up, and hope that it heals. Sometimes that works, and you went through the Cochrane review, and in many cases, it doesn't work. And once you go to a second surgery, now you're in a cascade. That's right. Just the erosions. The really devastating complication that nobody ever really talked about until the litigation started and people started to become more aware was the pain complaints. Because what happens with the mesh is it's put in your body. That's a wound. Technically, you now have a wound in your body. It's been cut open. Well, what happens with a wound is it heals. Think of any wound like a splinter in your finger. Then what? So you're going to heal. Think about the phases of the healing. It's going to be inflamed. Your body's going to try to clean out little pieces of wood if there's little pieces of wood after you pull out the splinter, and then there's going to be a little scar. And then eventually the scar is going to dry out and it's going to shrink. Well, that happens inside your body too, except that when you have a piece of mesh that's been wrapped around your vagina and it's blocking both your rectum and your bladder, and now that mesh is covered in tissue, and now it starts to scar because your body's natural reaction is to have an inflammatory response, attack the foreign body, and then fibrosis will form, which is scar tissue. Well, what happens is when it's caked in that scar tissue, the scar tissue then shrinks. And when the scar tissue shrinks around the mesh shrinks and it pulls and it tightens and it's not anatomically where it's supposed to be. It creates massive pain, except that you can't get to it. So how do you get to it? You have gynecologists doing what's called groin dissections, cutting into women's groins. That's orthopedic surgery. They weren't trained to do that. They're cutting deep into the vagina. They're taking out massive amounts of tissue, causing even more damage. And again, it's really, in most women, unfortunately, an unfixable problem. And so you have women all over the world right now walking around with tremendous pain. Like you said, they can't have sex. I'm not talking about some discomfort. There are women that have aperuria. There's dyspareunia, which is pain with sex. And then there's aperuria, which means it's so painful you stop. And I've represented, unfortunately, many women who have had very serious dyspareunia and have gone on to aperuria. And it's devastating to quality of life, pain. You're a chronic pain patient at that point. One of my favorite clients who I love testified at a trial about sleeping with ice packs between her legs. Wow. And that's been going on since 2012. And it's going to go on for the rest of her life. And she's one of many. It's really, it's an insidious issue that these companies never looked at, never cared about, never did anything about. Ticking time bomb, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you were to have give an estimate, I mean, based on how many cases have you litigated on this particular topic? And was it always on behalf of a woman who was harmed in this process? Or is it also, what do they call it, whenever like the public goes against a corporation? I can't remember what that's called.
Class action.
Class action. Has it been class action or both of these types of cases?
No, these were not class actions. They were individual cases. I represented, gosh, I'm going to give you round numbers, maybe 500 women or so. I have a little bit of a different business model than a lot of other law firms. I don't take more cases than I can actually handle. And this was over the course of over a decade. But there were other law firms that were advertising and had inventories of thousands of cases. At one point, the federal litigation The way it works in the federal courts is if cases get filed in federal courts, if there's a lot of them, they put them all in front of one judge. So the federal multi-district litigation went to one judge in West Virginia. There were, I think, at one point, 120,000 cases in front of him. We had our own consolidation of cases in New Jersey because a few of the large manufacturers were based in New Jersey. We had, I think, at one point, 15,000 cases or close to that. And then there were cases in a few other jurisdictions. So you're talking about over the course of the litigation, there were definitely at least 200,000 or more cases filed. Then there were a lot of cases that were settled that were never even filed. And there's probably a lot of other women that never realized they could bring a case. And unfortunately, there's still women every day getting an erosion, getting pain, getting diagnosed with a mesh issue for mesh that was put in 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever it is. It's a lifelong risk.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you're, speaking on this, you're going to get a lot of pushback, right? Because nowadays, what I think seems to happen, and this is for anybody out there who's training, let's say, to become an OBGYN. I don't know if anybody out there is listening, but hopefully they will be tuning into this one. I have a lot of midwives and a lot of woman care providers and whatnot who listen, but the OBGYNs, I think, are very confronted by home birth and informed consent around vaccines, go figure. But this one is particularly interesting because what I have seen happen in so many different instances in my training was that you hear something repeated so often that it just becomes like a dogmatic thing that you do. Like, of course we would do it that way because that's how we do it. So when an OBGYN or you're a gynecologist or somebody, who understands this stuff hears this, they're going to be like, come on. Of course we use mesh. We use mesh to repair hernias, and now we use it this. Like, what's the big deal? A couple women have this thing happen. The first thing I'll say to that is that if one woman has this terrible thing happen, that should definitely make you consider, is there something wrong with this approach? Or maybe could the technique be improved or whatever else? That should be the first thing, is just, you're not a statistic. If you're out there, you're listening, you've had one of these injuries. I really deeply care about the problem. The other thing is that when you are in a position like you, Adam, and you're now litigating against dogma, it's going to be very confronting. So what approach do you take to get people to appreciate what real informed consent would look like for a person who does have bothersome vaginal bulge symptoms or prolapse symptoms?
Well, it's interesting. And I think I could start off by saying, not all doctors drink the Kool-Aid because it feels good to drink the Kool-Aid. I got into this litigation in a very funny way. I was never what we call a mass tort lawyer. I do that now, where you represent many, many people who've been harmed by the same product, the same device. I got into it through the pelvic mesh. What happened? I got a case referred to me as a medical malpractice case, a woman who had a pelvic mesh device implanted, and she was in all kinds of pain, having all kinds of problems. I'd never heard of it. I sent it to an OBGYN who looked at cases and was a very conservative expert. I only deal with conservative experts who say no most of the time. And he called me back and said, look, I don't think there's any malpractice here, but I would look at the product they put in, because these sales reps have been all over our office and we don't use it. We don't think there's a need for it. We're not using it, but I'm hearing bad stuff. This was right in the beginning. I filed the first case in the country against Johnson & Johnson in 2008. So we're talking 2007, this conversation took place. And then I started to poke around, and that's what pulled me into it. So number one, there are some doctors who actually use critical thinking. But the problem with the medical profession is, how do I get people to understand the informed consent? That's what you were asking me, what needs to actually be told. I get other doctors to be experts, high level, really well credentialed, who are willing to tell the truth, number one, who explain this is how it is. And you mentioned ACOG and the practice bulletin. I have a very interesting story to tell you about that, because the author of the practice bulletin was my primary expert, who's a wonderful, unbelievably brilliant physician.
No way.
Yeah, she was my lead expert, taught me everything, testified in every trial with me. Her name is Ann Weber. She is a intellectual genius when it comes to this stuff. She's a giant in the field. She was actually the doctor who was chosen by the NIH to run the pelvic floor research and development. I don't remember exactly what it was called, but in the NIH, she was the first one back in 2006 or 2007, wow. I believe. Um, she told it like it was. She told me what was wrong. She told me what people needed to be told. And when I would question doctors, I would get the same. I would question the implanting doctors, and they would look at me like, "You're going to tell me medicine? You're going to tell me what I don't know?" And I would start showing them the documents. And this is how I would get through. I would show them the internal emails. I would show them the internal PowerPoints. I would show them the internal studies that were never put out. I would show them the editing of documents by the internal doctors at these companies and show them that they had been lied to, they had been misled, and they had been used. I mean, it's always interesting when a doctor sees the internal sales emails and reports from the sales reps to their division managers at these companies talking about the doctor, saying, this one is really good. He or she will go along. We just take them out to dinner once a year and invite them to a training session, and we've got this person forever. I mean, when they see that, they start to realize I'm a commodity pusher. They don't respect me, even though they act like it. They're just using me to make money. And they would see that. And then you'd show them the internal documents where they would say, I hope nobody finds out about this. We don't want to warn about this. There was an email at one of the companies that literally said, if these post-operative complications with one of the prolapse mesh kits gets out, it will, quote unquote, scare the daylights out of doctors. I mean, and that was probably maybe, document number 25 in terms of the strong statements. Polypropylene is the best of a bad lot, and on and on and on. And when you show this to the doctors, what I would say to them is, hey, look, you have to get informed consent. You have to actually tell the risks and benefits to the patient, right? Yep. It's the law, right? Yep. So if you were told by the company a risk, you would tell the patient, absolutely. And you would put it into your risk benefit as to whether you're even going to recommend this procedure, right? Yes. And then you start to show them, well, were you warned that this could cause catastrophic, life-changing, permanent pain that could never be adequately treated for the rest of the woman's life? No, of course not. Would you have used it if you were told that? Of course not, but that's not what these products are. And then I show them the Mayo Clinic article that shows in 2009 that they started to study some of these cases and said these are causing life-changing complications, and they shouldn't even be used until level 1 studies are done, which were never done, and so on and so forth. So you can get through to some doctors. Now, there's some who are true believers, or they're so deep into these companies that they just like being treated like God and they like being paid. And by the way, you can buy off doctors cheap. Any doctor who hears this, they think, I made $10,000 from that company. That's pretty good. They should realize they're pretty cheap to buy off compared to what the companies are making. It was pretty astounding to me how easy it was to buy these doctors. When I would see what they were paid and say, wow, you sold your soul for that.
Yeah.
But that's unfortunately, that's the relationship, because these companies know so well how to manipulate doctors. They know there's a lot of God complex out there. There's a lot of, these sales reps kiss up to them and they treat them so like they're so important. And the ego, you stroke a doctor's ego, it's amazing how far you can get.
Yeah.
How do I know that?
Yeah.
Because I've read all the sales analyses and I've read the PowerPoints where they said this is how you do it. And one really sticks out in my mind. Target the doctors who can drive business. That was one of the sales PowerPoints I saw. So it's a lot to overcome. And it's not just healthy skepticism. It's also this bias that comes from, well, these people are my friends. These people like me.
Yeah.
They treat me nicely.
Yeah. I'd like to venture maybe into some other areas that perhaps you're not litigating on, but I think it helps to take a step back for a second and be reminded that the Food and Drug Administration, is that what the FDA, Food and Drug Administration? Yeah. The FDA is a government agency, right? That is tasked with helping to either give the thumbs up or thumbs down to different devices and products that are going to come into the medical clinics, right? So at what point did what compelled the FDA to make any statement at all? And how did these products get through without demonstrating safety and efficacy before the FDA gave its 3 thumbs up right from the beginning?
Well, interesting. There's 2 ways that a medical device can get on the market. We're talking medical devices now. Drugs are similar, but there's a little bit of a different process. But medical devices can either get on through what's called pre-market approval, where they run through rigorous clinical studies. I think that's about 1%. of the medical devices. The rest get through on what's called 510K clearance. It's a regulation that says if this medical device is substantially equivalent to another one that's already on the market, and you can show that, and it's basically a checklist and some paperwork you file, it can be cleared to be sold. And that's how all these products got on the market. None of them had pre-market approval. And they were all piggybacking on prior products. And if you followed the chain all the way back to the beginning, the start of the chain was some products that were actually recalled and products that were failed products, but nobody goes back to the roots. It's as long as you're somewhere on the tree, you're okay, even if the bottom of the tree gets cut out. So that's how a lot of these get on the market. And even when the FDA initially was starting to learn about these problems, because what happens is there's voluntary reporting of complications, but it's a very, very inadequate process.
Sort of like the VAERS, kind of like VAERS with
Exactly.
vaccines. Yeah.
The adverse event reporting, you submit this to a database and the FDA then looks at it and they start to collect the data and they put out reports. And if they get enough reports, they might go to the manufacturers and say, hey, there's something going on here. It takes a lot for that to happen. Usually it takes public pressure. The adverse event reports for these products, for example, were coming in and the FDA didn't really do anything. They ignored it. In fact, one of the companies, when they asked for 510K clearance for a product, they said, well, we're going to use as our predicate a different product and it's this other product. And the FDA said, well, we don't know about that other product. And they said, oh, we put that on the market because we didn't have to get 510K. So they didn't even bother with that. And the FDA said, okay, no problem. You can keep selling it. And you just do it now with this other new product. Not what they should have done, which is stop selling it immediately. You broke the law. We're going to fine you like crazy. We're going to look at this thing with a fine tooth comb. It was basically swept under the rug because here's the unfortunate reality of the FDA. In many cases, the people who work there are looking to eventually go to work for industry. And there's a very symbiotic relationship. A great deal of what the FDA does is the honor system. I'm currently getting ready for a trial having to do with generic blood pressure medications that were manufactured in China and India. And in those cases, one of the companies changed their manufacturing process in China and didn't evaluate the process and should have known based on basic chemistry that it was going to create chemicals that are used to give cancer to lab animals. So they were selling blood pressure pills in the United States for years that were contaminated with these substances that are deliberately used to give cancer to lab animals. And the FDA had no idea because the way it's done is the company had filed an amendment and said, oh, this doesn't create any of these types of impurities that people are worried about. And the FDA said, okay, they can't go around the world and do a fine-tooth comb inspection of every single manufacturing process in the world. They trust companies to do the right thing. And often they don't. That's a really good example of the company now, I took the depositions of many of their employees and everyone, oh, well, the FDA didn't catch it. Well, that's not the FDA's job. It's your job to evaluate your own product and then tell the FDA what you find. They're not sending a bunch of chemists into your factory for 6 months. And that's common because the FDA doesn't have the resources, in many cases, not the will, because they're tied so close to industry. Not what you want to hear, but it's the reality of the situation.
Hey guys, it's Nathan. Wanted to interrupt this amazing conversation very briefly to talk to you, specifically if you're a birth worker. This goes for doulas, childbirth educators, midwives of all sorts, whether you're out of hospital or in hospital, and especially the OBGYNs, the family medicine docs, those of you who are attending to births. I want you to ask yourself, if a person rolls into your practice and they're in labor and there's a bud emerging from the vagina, what are you going to do? What I was taught to do was, let's rush you to the operating room. Forget about informed consent. We have to do this through the abdomen. We have to do a C-section because the baby is breech. But frankly, I think a lot of women, rightfully so, want to avoid C-section, unnecessarily, of course. And so, if you were to just rely on your, let's say your OBGYN residency training, you're not going to have the skills to attend to a breech birth. The good news is most breech babies come out without any intervention at all. But in the rare chance that they have a nuchal arm or a hyperextended neck or whatever, you want to have those skills, and it requires practice on practice on practice to get those skills, which is why I started hosting an annual conference here in Louisville. And in 2024, we're going to be leveling up this entire program. This is the 2024 Born Free Twins Breech Conference, where you're going to be able to get plenty of simulator experience with very, very well-trained educators and instructors. You're going to hear from a variety of midwives and some doctors. This year, we're featuring the Spinning Babies team, Breech Without Borders team. Stu Fishbine's going to be there. Christine Laria is coming with the Breech Without Borders team. She was a recent addition. Carol Gauchi from the Pacific Northwest is coming. We're also bringing 2 keynote speakers, Machilo Motse, who's a newly crowned PhD from South Africa, as well as Doña Angelina Martinez Miranda from Cuernavaca, Mexico is coming. These are instructors that have quite a bit, a breadth of knowledge and experience in order to help round out your own education. I haven't even mentioned Tracy Vogel, who's an OB anesthesiologist. She's going to be coming in to talk about trauma-informed care. Hermine Hayes-Klein is coming to speak to informed consent. There is so much that we're offering here. And I've only gotten to the didactics part. There's going to be plenty of time to practice on very realistic mannequins. And there are going to be some other activities for you to do some healing and as a means of community building. So we're going to do some trauma release work, a musical odyssey with Rebecca Kelly G. There's going to be some ecstatic dance in the mornings if you're open to that. It can be very, very releasing because we've suppressed so much of this stuff throughout our lives that if we can't use our voice and our bodies in an expressive way, it's going to become a second chakra issue. It's going to impact our reproductive organs and our overall health. We're going to be screening Aftershock and having a panel discussion with Shawnee Benton Gibson and Omari Maynard, both of whom were featured in the film because Omari's wife, who is also Shawnee's daughter, she died as the result of what I would call medical negligence due to the color of her skin in the medical system. And that's what Aftershock, the film, is all about. We're going to do a breath workshop with Sarah Tremoli of Effigy Breath. There is just so much healthy food, healthy community, healthy conversation in a very, very safe space. No breakout sessions. You're all going to be in the same room together in a very intimate setting, which I think is very, very important for this work. If you're interested in coming, go to bornfreetwinsbreech.com. Register as early as you can because the price will gradually increase as we get closer and closer to the event. There are a few opportunities available for work exchange for students or people who are otherwise unable to attend for financial reasons. But everything will be on site at the Omni Hotel in downtown Louisville, a beautiful hotel with some very, very beautiful meals and beautiful spaces that we're all going to be sharing together. I hope to see you in Louisville. The dates are August 8th through the 11th with an opportunity to do either NRP certification or a simulator intensive workshop with one of our instructors on the 12th if you want to stick around. And for those who stick around, maybe there'll be some other goodies along the way. bornfreetwinsbreech.com. I hope to see you in Louisville. It sucks. It really sucks because, frankly, when I went to medical school, we learned a lot about pharmaceuticals. In fact, most people don't know this, but the vast majority of medical education programs, we're talking even the Harvards and Yales, especially the Ivy Leagues, they're receiving so much money from pharmaceutical companies that it's incumbent on them to teach primarily pharmaceuticals for managing things like blood pressure and whatnot. And maybe those medications are good sometime. The issue, however, is that, again, when you hear it repeated over and over and over, it becomes dogma. And then you become so myopic on this one therapy, surgery in this case, for pelvic organ prolapse. And the problem I have is that when I went to school, I honestly, truthfully, did not think I would have to review the guidelines as carefully as I do and cross-reference and make sure that I'm actually aware of what's in this drug. Because I thought that ACOG and ABOG and the NIH and the FDA and the CDC and all of that, I thought that they were going to be there to help me. And when people hear these conversations, like, we're not like, this is not conspiracy theory shit we're talking about. We're just talking about, like, here's the facts. Here's what's happening. That makes a lot of people very distrustful in these agencies that have been vested in with such power. I remember that movie. Do you remember that series? It was called Dope Sick with Michael Keaton.
Oh yeah, about the
And
opioids.
yeah, about opioids. Yeah. And, for those who don't know, this is about the Purdue Pharma, this big family of rich people. They created a market for a long-acting formulation of oxycodone. It's called OxyContin. A bunch of people got addicted, and now we have this opioid crisis, in large part due to some really shitty behavior on the part of Purdue Pharma. Well, one really compelling piece of that story that really ground my gears, Adam, was that the director, one of the directors, if not the director of the FDA, was later, who gave the approval, was later employed by Purdue Pharma. He was given a big fat paycheck after this whole thing. And that to me is like, are there like any good, like of good conscience people out there who are just like doing good work, trying to put people at the center of this conversation? These are human beings. This is their entire sexual experience that is going to be completely ruined, if not even their daily activities and whatnot, where they're actually injured and in pain now. Like, are there no, like, do the FDA people like what the hell's going on here? Like, where are the good people? Like, I would like to believe they're still there, but why are we only seeing headlines about bad things happening left and right in these agencies? Maybe I'm going a little too, maybe
No,
I'm
I think
indulging a
I
little
think
too
you're on
much,
the.
but
I've always been told by my dad, you want to know why anything happens, follow the money.
yeah.
I always felt like he was really cynical, and as I get older, I feel like he was on the money more and more. Unfortunately,
Mm.
you have to follow the money. You reminded me of something. I deposed an expert for a pharmaceutical medical device company, very large, one of the largest companies in the world, and their expert was a former FDA, very high up person. And when I'm taking his deposition, I said, I found out that what he was doing right before he left the FDA was he was running an enforcement division. He was heading up an investigation on a specific drug. He then left the FDA, went to work for the company that sold the drug, and then headed up the company's response to the investigation that he had been heading up. And I said, well, don't you have conflict of interest rules? He said, no, this would not actually rise to that level. I said, who writes the rules? We do. I'm paraphrasing. And it didn't violate any rules. And I had to actually sit back and say to myself, I thought I'd heard it all, because it was so blatant. And this is the FDA, and this guy could side switch on an investigation he was running and then go to the other side. That really knocked me back. And
Yeah.
but there are people that really are trying to do the right thing and are doing the right thing. I started to tell you before, you mentioned ACOG, American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the professional society of OBGYNs.
Yeah.
Supposed to stand for everything that's right, first do no harm, give doctors exactly the information they need, etc. Ann Weber, Dr. Weber, who
She's in Pittsburgh, right? Is she a Pittsburgh physician?
she ended up in Pittsburgh. She went from the
Okay.
Cleveland Clinic and
Oh,
then
okay.
started the fellowship program in urogynecology at the University of Pittsburgh. I think the Women's Hospital. And I don't know why.
Yeah.
It's McGee.
McGee Women's. Yeah. Yeah.
He
That's where
started
I've
the
known her
fellowship
name.
program
Mhm.
there. And so she wrote a practice bulletin in February 2007 on pelvic mesh. This was a new thing that was coming out. It had only been on the market for a few years. And she was asked, write this article, give our membership some idea of what's going on. Her conclusion was, based on the lack of data, these devices should be considered, and procedures, because again, they were selling a procedure, should be considered experimental until there's some real heavy data. Well, then what happened? I have the internal documents from the medical device companies. The problem is, if something's experimental, insurance doesn't pay for it. So at one company, there were internal emails, which I showed a jury while she was on the stand in a case against that company, where a couple of people in the sales and marketing department, I think they said, maybe we should call Vinny and Rocco to fit her for some cement shoes. named her, referred to her. And I showed her that on the screen in front of a jury and said, why is that significant to you? And to her credit, she said, it's unfortunate that they're worried about me as opposed to the safety of their patients. And that was really the bottom line there. Another company had a massive push behind the scenes, and they actually had emails where their medical director was saying, our involvement has to be behind the scenes. We can't be seen to be out front of this, but their paid doctors were all over ACOG. And then there was the email that came from one of those doctors to the marketing head at this company saying, I got great news. They're going to reissue the bulletin and take out the word experimental. We won. This was in September of 2007, like 8 months later after the first bulletin. So they took that out. So now, boom, it's open season. And Dr. Weber,
is that a good thing though, that it's open season? Maybe I'm reading between the lines.
When I say open season, I mean there's no limit on being able to get these procedures paid for by insurance. And the email back to this doctor was, I love you, man. I'm doing the happy dance in all capital letters. Dr. Weber resigned and wrote a letter to the International Urogynecology Journal, which she read to at least one or two juries during trials, saying, and I asked her, did you take this position after I hired you? No, this was before we ever met. So she wasn't somebody that I went to and said, hey, if I pay you, will you now say what I need you to say? I don't do business that way. And that's not how things work, really. You're never going to win a case like this with someone like that. She was a legitimate expert who took a principled stand before anyone ever contacted her. I got very lucky to meet her. And she basically said the people within ACOG bowed to the pressure from the pharmaceutical industry. And now these products are out there and I can't be a party to that. So there are people trying and there are people speaking up. It took time for more people to catch on to this. But again, people don't like to be boat rockers. People like to, in the medical profession, they want to be the vice president of ACOG. They want to be the treasurer, secretary, or president of American Urogynecologic Society, AUGS. These societies were putting out statements saying these are safe procedures. These products are safe. Don't believe what you're reading. Except the problem was the people who were writing these, we found out because we took their depositions, were doctors who were being paid by the companies to say these things. So, yeah, should we give up? No. Should we be very skeptical? Yeah. Should every person who goes to a doctor ask questions about, okay, you're recommending this. Are you aligned with this company? Are you being paid by this company? Very important questions. Now, if a doctor bristles at those questions, I'd go find another doctor. Because a doctor should be open. And if the doctor's being paid by that company, the doctor should be able to say, yes, I do some research, I do this, and let me tell you what I do. If the doctor pushes back and says, you don't need to know that, the answer should be, well, I don't really need to be with you. There's plenty of other doctors out there. And this is what I tell people a lot, because I know, what can you do as a patient? How can you protect yourself? You can ask questions. You can be a tough consumer of medicine. You can be very thoughtful, and you don't have to believe everything a doctor says. And I know I'm kind of filibustering you, but I remembered one thing I really want to say that I learned through all this.
No,
I learned when
you're not filibustering at all.
I learned when I got involved in this litigation something I never knew. And this really speaks to the difference between men and women and how they interact with the medical community. I found out the level of disrespect and belittling that women endure when they go to their doctors, their OBGYNs, their regular doctors, as opposed to how men are treated. When I started to see the medical records and call my clients and say, this says that you refused this. This says that you weren't listening. This says, and they would look at me and say, I don't know what you're talking about. This didn't happen. And then I started to really dig into this because I started to realize the doctors didn't actually listen to their patients most of the time. They didn't want to hear what they had to say. They documented based on rote documentation, especially when they got to the electronic medical records part of existence. When it went from writing something down to just clicking a button, everybody had the same records, the same reports. But when I saw how women are treated, it really broke my heart.
Yeah.
Because then I would speak to women that were in my family and friends, and they would say, yeah, this is how it is.
Don't you have a daughter too?
Yes.
Yeah.
I found this out and I couldn't believe it, because men, we push back on a doctor, and a doctor might I'm not saying all men do this, and I'm not saying you can generalize it all, but this generalization was something that woman after woman after woman who I represented told me it happened to them. And it was this pattern. And that's something that I think is it's just an unfortunate fact of how women are treated by the medical community. Sweeping back to the pelvic mesh issues, I can't tell you how many women the record said, she still needs to heal. She needs to get used to her body. She's exaggerating. I mean, meanwhile, it turns out that, yeah. And it's funny, the Mayo Clinic article that I was referring to before showed that very few women actually returned to the doctor who put the mesh in when they started to have really serious complications. They'd go somewhere else. So the original doctor, and again, you asked, how do you talk to doctors? Most of them didn't know when they had really catastrophically harmed somebody, how bad it was, because the woman wouldn't go back to them because they were tired of being told there was nothing wrong with them. So then they would do their research and find the couple of doctors around the country that actually understood these problems and took care of these problems. I remember showing a doctor who was the person for Johnson & Johnson in New Jersey on the pelvic mesh products for years. He was the guy. I think he had done 700 of the prolapse kits at one point in a very short time. He was the implanter for one of the cases I had. So we tried the case. He was on the witness stand and a jury was watching him. And he was, as far as I knew, these products were good. I was putting them in. Everything was terrific. I didn't have any of these issues. And this was, by the way, on the questioning by J&J's lawyers. They were feeding it to him. Oh, Slater told you all these things, but you've never seen any of this happen to your client. No, my patients, they've all had good results as far as I know. I had 2 crack associates who said, wait a second, he operated on 2 other of our clients. They ran upstairs, they printed the records, brought them down, and I showed them the records of 2 other of his patients. Said, this is you, right? You put this in. Okay, well, let's look. Here's 3 operations to remove the mesh. You didn't know about that, did you? No, that's pretty bad stuff, isn't it? That's permanent damage. Yeah, here's another patient. You didn't know about her operations because they left you, because they got tired of you telling them everything was okay and they moved on. This guy, you could see him sink because he realized he just had no idea. And he probably had ignored a lot of things. But seeing that moment, it's one of those moments you don't get very often in court. You see him on TV a lot, but this gotcha moment. And it was a real eye opener because this was a doctor who was training all the doctors in the New Jersey area.
Wow.
People were being flown from all over the country to be trained with him. So he was training the company line to these doctors. I said, you trained all these people. You didn't tell them about these risks. No, I didn't. Wouldn't you have liked to? Yeah. If you knew these things, would you have used these products with my client? Mrs. I'm not going to say her name right now. No, of course I wouldn't have. So the information is important. It's hard to get. It's hard to get to the doctors who are going to resist. They really have to have the will, I think, to learn.
Well, and I think that I'm going to try to be as compassionate as I can for my colleagues who, for example, maybe don't realize the horrific trauma of how they spoke to that woman who is in labor or whatever, right? Like, being held down and having somebody shove something inside of you doesn't feel very good. And that doctor is probably not a bad person. That's how they were taught. That's how they've been teaching residents, that this is how we do informed consent. Even if it's a little bit coercive, it doesn't really matter. Your baby's going to die if we don't do this. You take them to the C-section. They don't ever come back to you to tell you how horrific that was. And if you were willing to hear their story, would you have the time or incentives to sit there and just hear for an hour about how horrific that was? I'm not saying that doctors are great people, but what I am saying is that you don't know what you don't know. And that's the reason I wanted to talk about this with you. And this is why I have these types of conversations is if you're a doctor out there, just because you haven't seen those bad things might be that your client didn't come back to you and you never would have seen them again because they were so, maybe we don't even have to say traumatized, but they're in so much pain and they have such regret over having that procedure. They don't ever want to see their surgeon again. That's a part of this. Absolutely. And so that coming to the epiphany, the light bulb going off is probably like, oh my God, how much harm have I caused? And that might actually be a compelling sort of rehearsal for people. Just imagine, what if you don't know how many women you've hurt in your career? And if you did know, would you be willing to hear it and absorb it and say, I was wrong and I'm going to do things differently? That's what this is really all about. This isn't a matter of saying good and bad, good or evil and all of that. But if you're not willing to hear women, you're not willing to appreciate just how horrific that thing was, and you were a part of that, then nothing's ever going to change. So I'm hoping that one by one, minds and hearts can just be turned around to say, like, just look at this for a moment, just look at this as if you weren't involved, and ask yourself, what if this was my mother, my daughter, my wife, whatever? Would this be okay with you? And if not, then come and join this party where we're all trying to just shift the aircraft carrier even the slightest bit north, so we can get out of this mess. But until people are willing to do that, I guess we're just going to have to keep fighting the fight.
Well, I'm glad that you shifted back to looking at it from the flip side, because I don't want to be seen as a person who hates the medical profession, wants to bash doctors. My uncle, who I love dearly, is an OBGYN.
No kidding.
He very recently retired at the age of 90. He's a wonderful doctor. He delivered, I think, probably half the girls I went to high school with. I don't have an issue with doctors per se. Some of my best friends are doctors. My uncle, OBGYN. I think that there's a tremendous problem in our society with not supporting doctors, not making medicine a profession and a pathway that the best and brightest will want to go down. I think that's true in our society for a lot of really important things: teachers, police, fire, etc. I think that there's a lot of things that we could do to make it more attractive for people to want to be doctors, and make it easier to practice medicine in the way that you're talking about, Nathan, to be compassionate, to be able to have the time to have those conversations. Because what I learned from most doctors is they spend more time on paperwork and typing into a computer than they do actually treating patients. The system is very burdensome. It's very difficult. The things you need to do to be a really high level doctor, it takes a really long time. That's fine. But let's make the process something that's going to be more attractive, so that we're going to attract more people to want to do this, and to have the best people. But again, let's restructure medicine in a way where money has to be a part of the process, and there has to be incentives, but it shouldn't be so burdensome to do the paperwork and to do the administrative work that you can't actually be a doctor. And I've had so many doctors who complain to me about their inability to just do what they want to do, which is to help people. And I don't have the solution to that, by the way.
Yeah.
I think that there's much smarter people out there that probably have good ideas about this. But I agree with you. I think that doctors want to do the right thing, but they're caught up in a system that has its own inertia. And once they fall into the stream, the current's going to take you where it's going to take you, and you're going to go where your mentors take you. You're going to go where you see somebody that's really impressive speak at a conference. That's going to resonate with you. And you don't know that that person is shilling for a medical device company or a pharma company in a way where the data is being skewed. I mean, I could tell you a lot of things that I learned along the way. One of them was about the importance of scientific data, because doctors will oftentimes need to see a study. They need to see something that shows that this treatment or this procedure or this device or this medication is going to be efficacious and safe for their patients. There's a tremendous involvement of the pharma industry in the literature that goes out there. I had one notable experience where there was a very important study that came out to support one of these pelvic organ prolapse products. And it was in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is considered to be the highest level medical journal, I think, in the world, or at least it's always been thought of that way. We then got the internal emails where it showed the medical directors at this company editing this article by this European doctor and taking things out that they said, we don't like this, we don't like how this sounds, to make it better for marketing the product after the fact. I ended up having the opportunity to depose the executive editor and the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. I had to go up to some building in Massachusetts. I had to fight motions they made to a Massachusetts state court judge to try to block me from taking their depositions. To the credit of that judge, she allowed me to depose them because she recognized that we had a legitimate right to this information. The bottom line was that the information we got from their files showed that their article wasn't accurate, and they'd ignored information, and the article had been partially ghostwritten by people within the company, and it had been misled. They had been misled. They then did a correction. They should have retracted the whole article. They did a correction. A correction is a little thing that gets put into a later edition that if you have a magnifying glass, you'll find it, where they say, well, there were some issues and we changed this and this. But I will tell you that article was never used again in one of my trials because we had such damaging evidence against it that the manufacturer agreed never to try to use that article. This is New England Journal of Medicine article.
Wow. Yeah.
That there were emails to the top of the entire company saying, this is what we've been waiting for. This is what we needed. And when we would try the case, they wouldn't even pull the article out because it would have been so devastating, the evidence that we had about how it was made. And that was the trade-off. And we said, fine, you don't get your article. We don't put these things in. That happens a lot. That was, again, a major eye-opener to me because I was very skeptical the New England Journal of Medicine would be hoodwinked or allow this to happen. And I found out they were hoodwinked. And then even when they knew about it, they didn't take the strong action I thought they should take. They took a little action. But at least maybe they became more aware and were more careful in the future, I hope. But that article probably led to a lot of operations being done on women because I know the company was out there showing that article to every doctor they were marketing to.
Yeah, I wonder if I remember during the years of COVID, I remember a variety of studies. There was one that was a massive, like many country, like multinational study looking at hydroxychloroquine as a treatment, option. And none of us had heard about this study. How could 100 some country, whatever, it was like 120 different hospitals on every continent, except for Antarctica. And they published this massive study in The Lancet, which is right up there with New England Journal and Nature and all these major, huge, multinational journals. To get an article in The Lancet is nearly impossible. Like, you have to be at the top of your class. And this study was published and then about a month later retracted. And it was like, I couldn't believe my eyes. I was like, you retracted it because of why? We weren't able to validate their data sets or something like that. And I was like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, you're The Lancet. You're The Lancet. Like, if this can happen in The Lancet, and then of course, Marcia Angle of the New England Journal, former editor, she came out and spoke about the pharmaceutical industry's influence. John Giardini's book, The Illusion of Evidence-Based Medicine, Ben Goldacre's work. Like, there's all these people now coming out of the woodwork saying, hey guys, we've got a problem here in the publication industry itself. And going back to what I said about trusting 3- and 4-letter organizations, I thought that they would have my back. I thought that I wouldn't have to go and do all of the primary sourcing of the data myself. But now that's a part of what I have to do because I don't really feel like I can trust them. I feel like the public is losing trust in these publications. So I'm wondering if you could share, if you were to guess, I don't want to talk about the COVID stuff because that is a dead horse that has been beat over and over, and everybody has, everybody's right and has an opinion. And but let's look at something like Ozempic. I'm sure you're aware of this new semaglutide. It was designed for diabetes. It's not actually a very new product, but it's been reformulated now as Ozempic. It's being promised to offer weight loss and all this stuff, and everybody now is popping this. And they have these public figures out there from Harvard and the obesity researchers and whatnot that are all talking about how important this is. And there's also bills being passed around the country to try to get insurance to cover this for this, probably the same reasons as you mentioned with open season there.
Familiar story.
So, what's that?
It's a familiar story.
Yeah, it just seems to keep repeating. So when you look at it, something like Ozempic and all these people in CNN and wherever, you see it all over the place. Would you say that it's like 99% of these people are actually being paid by the industry to get up there and just speak with their credentials to the importance of taking these drugs and how this is the savior for all the overweight people in our country? Are they all being paid off? Like, is that possible?
I won't throw a percentage at you, but based on my experience and what I've seen, usually if somebody's out there speaking about a product, they're being paid by the company. They will tell you, well, I'm not paid for my opinions. I'm paid for my time. I'm part of an advisory board. That's a lot of these people get paid a lot of money to be on an advisory board, and they ask for my opinion on things. So I'm not being paid for this speaking engagement. I'm paid for other things unrelated, but does it really matter? I think the odds are, yeah, they're being paid a lot. And this is how they sell these things. This is what these companies do because they know how to market these products. And the Ozempic cases just got centralized in a federal court in Philadelphia because there's a lot of people who have been seriously harmed because it causes gastroparesis and it causes all sorts of intestinal
bowel
problems.
obstructions and pancreatitis and intestinal issues and
God forbid you're somebody,
sarcopenia.
and God forbid you're somebody that was on it and didn't know about the risk and went in for surgery under anesthesia and you hadn't eaten for 10 hours, but you didn't know that because of the Ozempic, the food took longer to get through your intestine and
Now
you
you're
aspirated
regurgitating
while
it.
you were having surgery. They didn't, nobody knew. So there you go. This is another litigation. It's unfortunate. And, I hope what we're talking about, there's very few people out there who I think have no knowledge that money is involved. I think most people say, yeah, of course, that's just how it is. But there's good people there. And I think to a large extent, there are plenty of good people in the system. And not every drug and not every device is a bad idea or unsafe. And not every encounter with medicine is bad. I had 2 shoulder surgeries in the last 5 or 6 years. I love my surgeon. He's an amazing guy. He said very few words to me during the times I was with him because he was a busy guy and working on a level that most people would never sniff. But he fixed both my shoulders. I love the guy. He was all business. He did the right thing. And he used certain things. And I asked him some questions. Well, what are you going to use to anchor my shoulder back together, et cetera? And he kind of laughed and said, oh, yeah, I forgot what you do. And he explained it to me. He took the time because I asked the question. And he went ahead and it went terrific. And I felt very fortunate. So there's clearly people out there that are really doing the right thing and want to do the right thing. But the money is insidious. And if somebody doesn't want to do the right thing or doesn't know how to do the right thing or isn't aware of how they're being manipulated, then that's a system that's set up for these large problems to come up when it happens on a mass scale. And but then I always like to bring it back down again to the individual. You can't know everything. You can't be scared of everything. You have to be, I think, skeptical. You have to be careful, and I think you also have to understand the power of grassroots. When I was working on the mesh litigation, I became involved with a group in helping provide information to them and then testifying to the Scottish Parliament about the mesh devices. It was a group of mesh injured women in Scotland. They found a person at a newspaper who was interested. They marched on Parliament. And at the end of the day, these products were pulled off the market in Scotland, the first country in the world. They started a worldwide movement on this, and the products then got pulled off in the UK and Australia and other places. This was just regular women who've been very badly hurt who said, I'm sorry, but we're not going to let you step on us. We're not going to let you just push us off to the side. We're going to become a real problem, and we're not going to be shut up. And fortunately for them, there were people in the Scottish Parliament who cared and who listened to them and said, this is wrong. So I think that there's the will out there, but there's powerful forces that the will is against. And it's right there happening right now. You talked about Ozempic. It's happening right this second. That battle's happening all the time.
Do you think, final question, I know we're coming up on the hour here and I like to keep these things pithy. Adam, thank you. You've shared so much. And I want to mention to everybody listening, living a healthy life is important to me. Adam plays adult, like real deal baseball. And that's why he had those shoulder surgeries. So good for you for like being one of those adults that still plays, but also is staying fit. Good for you.
Thank you.
If their interest is piqued here, generally speaking, when a study is, or even a PowerPoint is presented at a conference, one of the first slides, or in a study, it'll have a list of conflicts of interest or disclosures by the authors or the speakers. And it'll say, I'm on the advisory committee for the Moderna vaccine or whatever, and I'm going to talk to you about the Moderna vaccine. So now you can know that there's a conflict of interest here. That's a part of this publication thing. My first question is there ways around that? And you may have already alluded to it, but the second part is ACOG's practice guidelines and committee opinions are unauthored. Of course, somebody wrote them, but there is not a list of authors. In fact, the mesh committee opinion that you mentioned that Ann Weber, I presume, or even pelvic organ prolapse that Ann Weber was involved with, her name's nowhere on there. So fortunately, she's one of the good ones. But what if, Joe Schmo, who also is getting a little kickback from one of these device manufacturers, I think you mentioned, it wasn't Abbott. Who is it? It's Johnson & Johnson. If he was on that committee, you would think that would have to be disclosed, but it's not, because it's not a scientific publication. It's a guideline document. So what do you recommend? So the first question was, is there a way around that? And the second question is, what are OBGYNs to do whenever all of their practice guidelines are being written by ghostwriters, as far as we know, who may or may not have conflicts of interest?
Well, the answer is you can't always know. There were plenty of articles that were published in the peer-reviewed literature at major journals where we looked at them and realized that the authors did not disclose their conflicts because we knew from internal documents they were being paid. It's very hard to deal with. What I would recommend for physicians who are being presented with practice bulletins or recommendations or PowerPoints, there's always a bunch of references for the propositions. This article is cited for this article is cited for that. What you often find is what you have to do is actually go to the references and see what the reference actually says. In the mesh litigation, there were some very strong professional bulletins from AUGS, for example, saying that these were very, very safe products. We then went and read the articles very carefully that were referenced, and they didn't stand for what they were cited for. Like they cited one for hernia mesh has been used for many years inside the body. If you actually read the article, it was the article talking about the fact that the mesh is too heavy, the pores are too small, and it causes catastrophic pain, and it needs to be re-engineered to be safer. But that's not, but they were citing this article as hernia mesh, wonderful, been used many years. And then if you went through every reference in there, pretty much every single one of them, it was the same thing. It's cited for this, but then there's this horrible language in the reference. So what I say to doctors is you have to actually read carefully, like you did in medical school, and read with an eye towards, what are they trying to get me to think? Who's trying to manipulate me? Who's trying to get me to use this? And all it takes is just being a good student and just reading, because I would think you go through a couple of those references and would say, oh, this is junk. It doesn't stand for the proposition that it's cited for. I'm not going to listen to that. But who has the time? I realize who has the time. You have to make the time, because you're going to make decisions that are going to affect people's lives. But that's the medical profession's obligation. They have to police themselves. They have to police themselves. They have to have the level of rigor and intellectual honesty that's expected of them. They have to do the right thing. You're doctors. People look to you to be some of the most important backbones of our lives, and we expect more of doctors. You're not just a business person. You're not just somebody in an office. You're a person we go to protect our health. So you have to do more, and you have to live up to it. And I have no problem with paying a lot of money to doctors to do that and making their lives easier and incentivizing them to be able to do that, because it's better for all of us. But there's no excuses. Don't tell me you were too busy. See less patients, do something else, but don't do it halfway, because you're going to hurt people.
And it certainly wouldn't stand up in court. Well, I didn't have time to read the paper. I just had to trust what the guy with the donuts said. I mean, that's honestly what it comes down to a lot of times is, we've got our incentives all twisted in our society in general, but it's specifically in medicine. Gosh, Adam, I could go so much deeper on some of these things, but I think we'll leave it at that. And I think after we get some feedback, maybe we can do like, a Q&A or something, because there's very few people, I think, that understand the complexities of this. This isn't just like people see, the you're in a car accident, call me kind of thing, like on the side of the road. And people think that that's what lawyers are, is just like billboards that are out there to get easy money. What you're doing is not easy. And I really appreciate that you don't take more cases than you can actually brief in a timely, responsible, complete manner.
No
Yeah,
billboards.
no billboards, right? Right. I don't know how we would decorate your billboard, but it would probably not be something people would want to see on 64 East, every day going to
I'm
work.
not a
But
billboard guy. I'm
yeah,
that's
yeah,
not my scene.
yeah, yeah. Adam, thank you. If somebody were to just need to reach out to you to ask you something, or if they wanted some follow up, or maybe they want to interview you and blast this message out further, where can people find you? Should we just include like your firm's website in the show notes, or what do you think?
Sure. I mean, the easiest way to get me is Google my name. You'll
Yeah.
come up. You'll come up to my law firm. You'll see my information. You just email me. That's the
Okay.
best way to get me, is to just email me directly. I unfortunately respond to my emails. If I can't get back to I get a lot of requests. Hey, can you look at this case? We, we do that. We look at every case. We get back to everybody. Frankly, I love to just talk to people that reach out to me with a question. I've
Yeah.
talked to so many people who I wasn't ever going to represent. They had another lawyer, just to put them at ease, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But I'm easy.
Yeah.
I'm easy to find. I'm not hiding out. You
Yeah.
Google my
Yeah.
name, you'll find me real easy. And then just shoot me an email. I'd love to talk to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Adam. Really, really appreciate your time. And if we have more to chat, we'll get you back on the show. Okay.
This was great, Nathan. Thanks for what you're doing. I really
Yeah,
appreciate you
absolutely.
having the time to talk to me.
Yeah. Thank you.